My grandfather was part of an all-Japanese division of the U.S. Army during World War II, the 442nd. They were the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. Most of these men, my grandfather included, fought for this country while it held members of their own families in internment camps. Collateral for their job well done. Can you imagine the pressure, the crushing weight that if you miss these shots, if you fail this mission, you may not just lose your own life, but the lives of your family members? It's servitude to people who spit on you when you come home, your family's only ticket to freedom. Now, obviously, it was never directly stated that serving the U.S. military would earn your family's freedom. But what better way to look loyal to the state? What better way to prove that your family wasn't the problem than to sign your life over to defend your would-be jailer? The 442nd's motto was go for broke, and they would, over and over as they liberated townships, broke up Nazi strongholds, and assisted in the liberation of Dachau, among many other wins. Pressure makes diamonds. My grandfather came home with 5 bronze stars and a silver star. He barely spoke for the remainder of his troubled life. In Helldivers 2, they don't literally hold your family hostage in order to encourage servitude. They use good old-fashioned rhetoric.
No! Sweet liberty!
You aren't just serving the war machine, you're fighting to protect your family back home. We're killing these bugs for liberty-centric reasons. Ignore the fact that no one inhabits these planets you're fighting bugs on. How are they getting there, you ask?
We're not paying you to think, Helldiver.
This is pretty similar to how the U.S. handles its enlistment promotions in the modern day too, other than the old, this is the only way you'll ever get an affordable education with your grades gambit that they've added to their repertoire. Also, it's important to note that while what I'm saying might apply to some other countries, I'm primarily going to be talking about the U.S. military-industrial complex because I live there. I know about it. They float the whole you fight so they don't have to thing, despite the fact that this hasn't really been the kind of fighting the U.S. military engages in for quite some time. We fight small proxy wars in countries that the American public doesn't care about for reasons that are very likely not the ones told to the public. Whether or not 9/11 was an inside job, which honestly, from my perspective, who the hell knows? I was 6 years old at the time. It made for the perfect opportunity to justify all the democracy we've spread over the years. Helldivers is a satire of this exact behavior, a hyperbolic and Orwellian vision. There's literally a ministry of truth in the game of a spacefaring Earth, united under a globalist government that wages war against 3 major threats across the stars. I'm going to do a little bit of lore mixing here, as the original Helldivers contains more lore than Helldivers 2. The bugs. Actual origin, Earth. This is a cicada now. Feel old yet? No, just kidding. They're from space. Unfortunately for all the people caught in the crossfire of future conflicts with them, they produce oil. This has led to Super Earth farming them for resources. And while this isn't necessarily confirmed, only suggested, potentially transporting them to other locations, either to later farm for oil, I guess, or to generate fervor for the conflict, and thus funding. The automatons. Previously, the cyborgs, kind of, it's a little weird. In the original Helldivers, the cyborgs were a race of separatist humans cybernetically augmenting themselves. Their eventual goal was to free humans from the brainwashing of the Super Earth government. At the end of the original Helldivers, they were killed or enslaved in equal parts. The automatons are presumed to be the cyborgs' creation or progeny. However, no longer requiring a body. They're self-repairing and hell-bent on destroying everything Super Earth stands for. The Illuminate, a peaceful race of extremely developed spacefaring aliens that Super Earth attacked on reports that they possessed weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, the parallels are pretty on the nose for these guys. They aren't currently present in Helldivers 2, so I won't talk too much about them. However, I have a strong suspicion that this will change as time goes on. The satire here has so many obvious comparisons. I mean, let's start with the bugs. In 1919, a geological survey determined that our natural oil resources in the United States weren't long for the world. Near and from that point, reaching far into the future, the U.S. is engaged in varying methods of obtaining oil or preventing other countries from obtaining oil through unscrupulous means. In January 2001, at the administration's first cabinet meeting, according to Paul O'Neill, the then Secretary of the Treasury. Vice President Cheney presented opportunities to seize oil fields in Iraq, complete with paper maps spread out on the table. We went to war with Iraq in 2003 after reports of WMDs which turned out to be false. Whether or not we ended up seizing any oil, it's important to note that both Bush and Cheney were oil men and likely profited immensely from the massive increase in the price of oil that occurred during the war. It later dropped, but I'm sure it was profitable while it went up. Now, this is likely the metaphor the team at Arrowhead was going for. To say that the context of the Iraq War was entirely based on oil might be an oversimplification. Some believe and have posed some evidence that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were targeted and made an example of in order to eventually implant a more liberal and westernized form of government, which would hopefully spread to neighboring countries. There have also been accusations recently surrounding politicians making decisions that essentially keep us from being energy independent, despite producing more than enough oil for our own purposes. We only have the necessary refining equipment to process the type of oil that we get from foreign powers. It's hard to know the intent when, for the most part, all we see is how things turned out. And getting a straight answer out of politicians reminds me of a really good George Orwell quote. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. But to get back to how this relates to the bugs, the idea that the Federation, in this case, would use conflict to manufacture a reason to yoink assets from another country, or planet in this case, or prevent enemies from using said assets is not far-fetched. There are numerous events that you can point to where many governments world over and their representatives have flatly lied to their populace in service of just about any interest but the common man. And the automatons, the spawn of a people killed and enslaved, are a much broader metaphor and can likely be applied to tons of conflicts throughout history where a force that decimates a population but leaves children behind sows the seeds of their next enemy. It brought to my mind Iran and the US orchestrated coup against a democratically elected government in 1953 to place the Shah in power. This eventually led to the 1979 revolution and the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran, where 52 US diplomats were held for 444 days, turning a US-backed monarchy into an anti-American theocracy. These tensions between Iran and the US have been the undercurrent of at least 10 conflicts spanning the Middle East, leading to significant losses in these regions. Children of conflict who grew up seeing the Western world as the villain. Whether or not that's slightly oversimplified, that's no less what they see. The point of this video, however, isn't necessarily what is done to manipulate in those consequences. It's about what happens to a group that numbers among the manipulated. The soldiers, the Helldivers on both sides of the coin. The 442nd was a segregated regiment, entirely composed of men whose racial background tied them to a country currently on the opposite side of the war. What do you imagine those in command did with that regiment? What conflicts do you imagine they were sent to fight? The 100th Infantry Battalion, a part of the 442nd, was known as the Purple Heart Battalion after suffering massive casualties. After their liberation of Brière's France, they had to use a bulldozer to move all the bodies out of the way. My grandfather, a part of Company H, was engaged in a hand-to-hand fight with numerous Nazis that lasted over 30 minutes after everyone ran out of ammo. I'll never know what exactly it was that bothered him the most, why he went silent, but I imagine this was up there. Shooting someone is bad enough, but exhausted men battering each other to death with fists, bayonets, and knives is genuine nightmare fuel. I can understand why he stopped talking. What could you even say about that? The Helldivers are fodder. They're referred to as special forces, but if this training segment is what qualifies as special ops training, then that makes me fucking Chris Kyle. Apparently, this training has a 23% survival rate, and I have to assume that the majority are lost here. The average lifespan of a Helldiver is 2 minutes. While not quite as dire, Depending on where you were located during World War II, your likely lifespan could have been weeks or days. Helldivers are entirely volunteers, drawn in by a rhetoric to preserve liberty, and instead are likely ripped to shreds, vaporized, or blown to pieces within minutes of touching down in a hostile environment. Chess pieces sacrificed for the necessary captures. You could go through over 20 Helldivers for the completion of a single mission. While the loss of life in a conflict is a tragedy, for many who survive it, the tragedy is only beginning. The Helldivers in Helldivers 2 are being manipulated to kill bugs and bots, inhuman and vicious things, regardless of Super Earth's part in their creation. Relatively easy to justify, easy to compartmentalize. When various governments manipulate people into killing, it's always people you'll be killing. You don't get any faceless bugs to exterminate or robots that may or may not pass the Turing test. You get people, families, fathers, sons, mothers, and daughters. When those commanding look at a map of forces, they see reds and blues, points of control. What looks organized on paper in person is chaos. People shooting, stabbing, kicking, clawing, and punching their way to any hope at survival. They may have entered the fray for messages to serve, to protect those at home, or for hopes of a debt-free college education, but I'd imagine it's unlikely that those thoughts are present or at all comforting when you're listening to a person choke on their own blood, or writhe in pain with a body covered in burns. Democracy or liberty is the last thing someone is thinking about when covered in viscera that used to be a friend. My wife's grandfather, Merle, who recently passed, may he rest in peace, was a kind, unpretentious, and warm person. Wore a smile even when things were looking grim for him. He was so old when we met initially, I don't think he ever fully remembered me anytime we went to see him or saw him in passing, but he always made me feel like he did. One of the last times we spent with him before he passed, he told us something. He wasn't really all there by this point, and the visit up to that was really disjointed subject-wise. He got this faraway look and said when he served during World War II, he shot away from people, intentionally missing because no matter how much he wanted to serve, he couldn't bring himself to kill someone. But one day he noticed someone too late, and they were so close that if he missed, it might be the last time he did so. He and some squad mates fired around the same time. The guy dropped. He didn't know if he killed that man. He didn't say anything else, but I could tell what it was that he was feeling. He was terrified. Terrified that he was unforgivable. That he was damned. When I was younger, I considered being a soldier. I liked the idea of serving something bigger than myself, contributing. Seeing that look, I'm thankful I didn't. True evil is hard to pin down, with so much gray area in the world, but Hitler was about as close to it as I can imagine. Merle might have killed a man in the course of fighting that evil at barely 18 years of age, and it haunted him until the day he died at 96 years old. He was a wonderful father and grandfather, but despite how much we're fed about the nature of war, duty, and cause, there is nothing natural about taking a life. A lot of people, in the pursuit of being anti-war, have become anti-soldier, anti-military personnel in general, not so much against the soldiers of World War II or the wars of the past that seemed more necessary than many of the ones we fight now, but against the soldiers of today, saying that they should have known what they'd be doing, should have anticipated the harm they'd do to themselves and to the communities they're sometimes sicked on like loyal dogs. 87% of enlisted are 18 to 24. I have a saying I frequent that you're at least kind of stupid until you're 25. Shit, I'm closing in on 30 and I'm still kind of stupid, so. Not saying that there aren't those who signed up just because they wanted to kick ass. There are, and I would have probably been one of those had I enlisted. The rhetoric regarding serving your country and protecting people back home made it easier to pretend that wasn't why I wanted to enlist, but that was definitely a part of it. I think people have a somewhat innate propensity for a degree of violence, some more than others. I mean, look at, the UFC, boxing. People love stuff like that. Gladiators going way back. Especially in your younger years when you're flooded with hubris and hormones. And clearly the government is somewhat aware of this, denying alcohol, a substance that reduces the inhibition of violent outbursts until you're 21, despite allowing you to die for your country 3 years earlier. I'm sure that's not all of why it's done that way, but all that to say, they know what they're doing when they push enlistment as early as 18, 17 with parental permission. So before you judge these kids, more or less, too harshly, remember how easily bad decisions came to you in that age range. Are there people in the military who enjoy the atrocities they have to commit? Probably. Are they the majority? The number of veterans that are suicidal, addicted, or experiencing homelessness would strongly suggest otherwise. How many Helldivers do you think realize it when they touch down, or a couple minutes later? They see the barren landscape, no people in sight, no society to liberate. Then it all starts to make sense. How can there be democracy when you only answer questions and then a computer votes for you? That's the real voting process in Helldivers, by the way. How can you protect liberty on planets with no people to free? But once you've signed, there's no conscientious objection when you realize the truth too late. It's just survival, and then the damage is done. This isn't to say that they're without choice or without responsibility, merely that we should have empathy for the fact that sometimes people choose wrong. To get all southern and Bible-y, let he without sin cast the first stone. Even when the public supports the troops, it's a very vapid and cursory support that equates to the kind of backpatting we give ourselves regarding a lot of difficult issues. Save the rainforest, house the homeless, feed the hungry, meat is murder. Thank you for your service. To judge them is wrong. To glorify them, equally so. Glorifying them glorifies the institution that directed their behavior. Glorifying them glorifies the wars they participate in, the actions they commit, forced or otherwise. The only good thing to do is try to empathize. Empathize with the fact that even if you believed them to be strong, the burden of what they've done may at times make them weak. It's easy to support the troops when all they're asking for is a business loan or a college education. What if they're asking for forgiveness after an emotional outburst, or understanding while fighting an addiction, or connection while their attachment to reality is thin and loud noises leave them in tears? Empathize with the fact that no matter what they thought they were getting into or why they did it, they dove into hell, and that changes you, for better or for worse. My grandfather was someone you'd likely hesitate to call a good man. Like many men of that generation, he was violent with his kids. He communicated poorly or not at all. He was temperamental. But he was also a leather worker. He made a beautiful belt that I still have and still wear. He loved to make things. He also loved my brother, a person who would ironically and sadly grow up to suffer from the same PTSD that he struggled with throughout his adult life. My brother was only his grandson by marriage, and my brother was half black. Japanese opinions of black people during this time period were largely not good. He could have fallen back on racism and rejected him, but he didn't. He was good to my brother, treated him like family. In that way, I feel he broke a generational curse. He passed the year before I was born. Sometimes I wonder how much better he'd have been if people talked to him more, if he'd let himself talk more. Obviously, a large degree of responsibility rests with him. You can't just let what you don't deal with dictate your behavior. You have to address your own problems. But now we have a lot of info about this. Back then, you just gotta be a man, and he hailed from an extremely strict and extremely abusive traditional masculine Japanese father, so the odds weren't in his favor to develop a good relationship with his emotions. I've heard more about his soldier escapades than I ever heard about him as a person. I feel like his family, my dad and his siblings included, saw him more as a soldier than a person, and people have a tendency to act in accordance with how they're treated. I imagine Helldivers struggle to shake it off when they're out of uniform, mourning fallen comrades and anxious that they made it this far. Maybe this is their final dream while they're laying ripped to pieces on a faraway planet while DMT gives them what they want to see one last time. I imagine when their families look at them sometimes they can see the automatons and bugs, the carnage and the fear reflected in their eyes. The ones whose families can't sit with that look are the ones we lose. The ones who close up or stop talking, repressing what they can't process until it comes out in the form of sickness, dysregulation, and repellent behavior. Merle would have been called a coward at the time for aiming away from the enemy, a traitor, much like what many of you will call me for making a video that questions the wisdom of the Federation. My grandfather was called a hero for killing them, but one was able to deal reasonably well with the trauma of war, raising a family with love, rarely known to be angry or yell at his kids. The other was an abuser and a time bomb, unable to cope with what he'd done, but at the same time unable to stop. He was a career soldier and later served in Korea and Vietnam. It's an impossible question of who was right. One stuck with their convictions and refused, until impossible to avoid, to do something that they believed would tarnish their soul irreparably. That takes courage in its own way, given how much pressure was on them to view the Nazis as inhuman monsters, whether or not that's partially correct. However, if every soldier on the Allies' side had done this, we'd have lost the war. Although, alternatively, if everyone had the same regard for human life as he did, even the ones that were considered an enemy, then there would be no war to fight. The other did what they thought was required of them, what they thought was necessary to save their family, regardless of how it might destroy them, regardless of how they might see every life they ended every time they closed their eyes, how it may come out as rage and abuse, and how they'd scar their own children by proxy, passing on the trauma as many parents do. Men like my grandfather won the war, but men like Merle made sure that there was still light in the world, and a world worth coming back to. Even though the world is rarely this easy, I hope there comes a day when we realize that none of this is necessary. I hope there comes a day where, no matter how much rhetoric they give us or how many false promises they make, they never convince another person to dive. And if that labels me a traitor, then so be it. Well, thank you guys so much for watching, if you made it this far. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. It really helps me grow this channel here. The response to the last Fallout video was incredible, and I'm very grateful that that got as far as it did. If you guys have any comments about this, if you're a veteran or not, really, if you have anything that if you agree or disagree with anything I've said here, I'd love to hear about your thoughts regarding the military as it stands right now and the military-industrial complex, all that shit. By some miracle, if somebody here knows someone or is related to someone from the 442nd, I'd love to hear about that too. That's a really cool, really niche piece of history there that I feel like a lot of people don't know. But other than that, you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and don't you dare go hollow.